The full moon gently illuminated the rocky path that wound out of the small town of Willow Creek. Mary Collins, her face pale and drenched in tears, clutched the hands of her children, David and Matthew, as she walked unsteadily toward a destination only she knew. Her mind was clouded, a mix of desperation and confusion pushing her to do the unthinkable, while her innocent children followed, unaware of the abyss they were being led to. David, 7 years old and the eldest, walked silently but uneasily. He sensed something was wrong, but his mother's distant and broken voice had ordered him to follow without asking questions. Matthew, just 4, clung to his older brother's hand, his small legs struggling to keep up with Mary's hurried pace. The woods surrounding them were dense, and the sounds of the night felt more threatening than ever. Mary breathed heavily, her thoughts disordered, searching for some form of justification for what she was about to do. "It's for their own good," she murmured to herself repeatedly, as if trying to convince herself. Finally, the well appeared before them, an ancient structure long forgotten, surrounded by weeds. Mary released her children's hands and approached the edge, peering inside. It was deep, so deep that the moonlight barely touched the darkness within. She stood trembling, her mind battling for one last shred of sanity. She knew what she was about to do was wrong, but something inside her, a dark force fed by her own suffering, pushed her forward. "Mom," whispered David, cautiously approaching, his worried gaze fixed on his mother's face. Mary turned slowly, her eyes vacant. David's voice shook her, but not enough. In a desperate impulse, she grabbed her children's hands again, and before they could protest, she led them to the edge of the well. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and pushed them. The children's screams echoed briefly into the night before fading into the well's depth. Mary stood frozen, her legs trembling, her eyes filled with tears as the silence enveloped everything. Then, with an immense effort, she turned and began walking back toward the town, her steps unsteady. But fate would not let the story end there. That same night, as Mary hid away in the solitude of her small house, life in the town continued as usual. Jane, a middle-aged woman known for her kindness and protective spirit, rested in her small cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Always alert to any strange noise, that night she was disturbed by a distant sound. A scream, almost inaudible, coming from the woods. Jane rose immediately, her maternal instincts awakening. She knew something was wrong and, wasting no time, woke up Tom, a young neighbor who often helped her with farm work. Together, they grabbed flashlights and, guided by Jane's intuition, began walking into the woods. As they moved through the darkness, the screams became clearer. These were not the cries of animals or the wind howling through the trees. They were human cries, children's cries. Jane quickened her pace, her heart racing. They reached the well. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Tom, seeing the old well. Both rushed to the edge. By the light of their flashlights, they saw something that made their stomachs turn. 2 small bodies, caught on a ledge within the well, still alive but terrified. David, holding his little brother tightly, looked up with eyes full of fear and hope. "Help!" cried David, his voice hoarse. Jane didn't hesitate. With unexpected speed, she instructed Tom to run and fetch a rope from a nearby house. The young man dashed back to town while Jane knelt at the well's edge, speaking softly to the children, trying to calm them. "Don't worry, little ones. We'll get you out of here," she assured them, though inside she feared the worst. When Tom returned, the next few minutes were chaotic, but with great effort, they managed to pull the children out of the well. Covered in dirt, David clung to Matthew, who sobbed uncontrollably. Jane embraced them tightly, her own eyes filled with tears. Though she didn't yet know how they ended up there, it was clear these children needed help, and fast. She took them to her house, cleaned them up, and tucked them in. Throughout the night, David, still in shock, told, through sobs, what had happened. Jane felt a knot in her stomach as she listened to the story of Mary, the mother who had abandoned her children in such a cruel way. As the children finally fell asleep, exhausted, Jane sat in the darkness of her living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. She knew that these children would never be the same, and a silent promise formed in her heart. She would protect them. She would be the mother they needed. Jane had no children of her own, but that night, something inside her changed. David and Matthew would never be alone again. As the days passed, Willow Creek returned to its usual rhythm. The incident at the well became a distant rumor, a story some whispered with disbelief, while others preferred not to speak of it. Mary had disappeared. No one knew exactly what had happened to her, and in the small town, there was no effort to search for her. It seemed that the fate of David and Matthew had been sealed on that final night. Under Jane's care, the two boys began a new life. The first few days were tough, especially for David. Though he was only 7, his eyes reflected an unexpected maturity, a mix of distrust and sadness that contrasted with the innocence a child of his age should have. Matthew, on the other hand, still fragile and dependent, followed his older brother's lead, seeking comfort from him that he once received from his mother. Jane, aware of the trauma the children carried, decided that the best way to help them heal was to provide stability, a routine. Every morning, she prepared their breakfast, taught them simple tasks, and gradually gained their trust. Tom, who lived nearby, became a constant figure in their lives. In his mid-20s, he was a hard-working, simple man with a good heart. He had grown up in the town and had always admired Jane, who had taken care of him more than once when his own parents couldn't. Tom found an unexpected purpose in helping with the boys, and in a way, he saw in David and Matthew a new opportunity to do something meaningful for his community. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, David and Matthew were playing in the yard of Jane's house. Though David kept an emotional distance, there were moments when his laughter escaped, a reflection of the childhood that still fought to emerge. Jane, watching them from the kitchen window, smiled. She knew the road to recovery would be long, but those small flashes of joy filled her with hope. However, that evening something changed in David. While they were playing, Matthew tripped and fell to the ground, beginning to cry. David rushed to him and hugged him. But the little boy kept repeating one word that froze Jane. "Mom, Mom," Matthew whimpered, clinging to his brother. David, his eyes full of restrained tears, looked around as if searching for an answer that would never come. Then, gritting his teeth, he picked up his brother and carried him inside. Jane watched them approach, Matthew in David's arms, and felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't the first time Matthew had called for his mother, but she had never seen such a strong reaction from David before. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" Jane asked softly, kneeling down to the children's level. David nodded, but his expression was serious. "Matthew's fine. He just fell," he replied firmly, without meeting her eyes. Jane knew there was more behind that answer. She understood that she couldn't force David to talk, so she decided to wait. She offered them some warm milk and suggested they play inside for the rest of the evening, something that always calmed the boys. But that night, David remained silent, lost in his thoughts. Hours later, after the children had gone to bed, Jane found Tom in the yard. He had come by to help with some heavy tasks and had stayed to chat. "David seems restless, doesn't he?" Tom asked, glancing toward the window of the boys' room. "Yes, I noticed," Jane responded, crossing her arms, deep in thought. "Today, when Matthew fell, he asked for his mother. And David reacted in a way I've never seen before. I think he still hasn't processed what happened." Tom nodded, but a question he had been holding back finally escaped. "Do you know anything about Mary?" he asked cautiously. "No one has heard from her." Jane shook her head. No one in the town had seen or heard from Mary since that night. The woman had disappeared like a ghost. And though some of the townspeople preferred not to speak of it, Jane couldn't shake the constant unease over Mary's absence. Something about that silence was more disturbing than any known truth. "I don't know what became of her, Tom, but no matter how terrible what she did was, she's still those children's mother. I fear that one day, we'll have to face her return." Jane sighed, resting her head in her hands. "But not now. For now, I just want to give them peace." With those words, Tom understood that the subject was closed, at least for the moment. Though Jane had taken on the role of mother with devotion, there would always be a shadow over David and Matthew, the ghost of their biological mother. David and Tom's business, with Matthew's unwavering support, was growing faster than anyone in Willow Creek could have imagined. What started as a small workshop had turned into a well-known destination in the neighboring towns, where tools, furniture, and wooden structures were increasingly in demand. At 18, David was already recognized as a serious and meticulous young entrepreneur, while 15-year-old Matthew had become a skilled craftsman, though his nature remained gentler and more reserved than his brother's. Jane watched with pride as her sons thrived, but a growing unease accompanied that pride. She knew that success couldn't erase the scars of the past. Although years had passed, the abandonment they suffered as children was a constant shadow. Despite Jane having built a home full of love and safety, the ghosts of that night at the well still lingered in David's silences and Matthew's nostalgic glances. One autumn afternoon, when the yellow leaves covered the paths and the cool breeze whispered through the trees, David and Matthew were working in the shop, busy with a large order for a nearby town. As always, Matthew tried to make David smile with his playful nature, but David, focused as usual, kept his eyes fixed on his work. Suddenly, the sound of a carriage approaching broke the quietness of the day. "Are we expecting anyone?" Matthew asked, wiping his hands on his apron. David frowned. They weren't expecting a client at this hour. They stepped outside the workshop, and to their surprise, a woman descended from the carriage. Her figure, though marked by age, seemed vaguely familiar. David felt a chill in his stomach, as if the air around him had suddenly thickened. Matthew, less aware, curiously stepped forward. Jane, who was gathering vegetables in the garden, also noticed the visitor's arrival. When she saw the woman, she dropped the basket in her hands. Mary Collins had returned. Mary's eyes were sunken, and her face reflected the toll of time and regret. She wore tattered clothes, and her expression was one of pure exhaustion, as if every step toward Jane's house pulled her further from the forgiveness she sought. When her gaze met David's, something inside her broke. He was no longer the child she had abandoned. He was now a man, strong, with a life that flourished despite her absence. "David, Matthew," Mary's voice trembled, a mix of hope and guilt. Matthew, who until then hadn't fully grasped the situation, was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of memories hitting him like a storm. The image of his mother, the well, the darkness. He instinctively stepped back, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "This can't be," Matthew whispered, looking at David for some explanation. David stood frozen, his fists clenched. All the suffering, anger, and sense of betrayal he had buried for years began to bubble up inside him. He walked toward Mary, his expression devoid of the tenderness she had hoped to find. "What are you doing here?" David asked, his voice low and dangerous. Mary, feeling the ground beneath her trembling, tried to step closer. "I came to ask for forgiveness, to explain what happened," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day. I left because I couldn't bear it. I was lost, confused. But I always loved you." Matthew, always the more sensitive of the two, stared at his mother with tears in his eyes, unsure how to process what was happening. On one hand, this was the woman who had brought him into the world, the one who gave him life. But on the other, this was the same woman who had abandoned him, left him for dead in that well, in the deepest darkness. The mix of emotions was unbearable. "Love isn't what you did," David interrupted, his voice firm and controlled, though the hatred inside him was barely contained. "You left us to die. You didn't even look back, Mary. You just pushed us." David's words fell like a sentence. Mary, devastated, tried to move closer, reaching out to her eldest son. "You don't understand. I wasn't well. I was so broken inside that I didn't see any other way." She tried to justify, her tears now uncontrollable. "And that justifies abandoning us?" David replied, never breaking eye contact with her. "Maybe you were broken, but that doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change that someone else had to save us, that someone else became our mother." Jane gave us everything you couldn't. Jane, who had been silently observing the scene from the doorway, felt a knot in her chest. She had feared this moment for years, and though she was confident in the love David and Matthew had for her, she knew that Mary's return reopened deep wounds, ones that time had not fully healed. Matthew, unable to endure any more, took a step forward. "Mom," he said, but his voice faltered. He wasn't sure if he was calling out to Mary or Jane. He was lost between memories and the present, between pain and the desire to forgive. Mary tried to seize the moment. "Matthew, please. I'm so sorry. I never stopped loving you. I just want a chance to be your mother again," she pleaded, her voice broken with desperation. But before Matthew could respond, David spoke for both of them. "You have no right to ask that," David said coldly. "We already have a mother, and it's not you." Mary felt as if her heart had stopped. David's words were more painful than she could have ever imagined. She had expected rejection, but not such a definitive judgment. Her legs shook, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. The oppressive silence that followed was unbearable. Matthew looked at his biological mother with a mixture of pity and pain but said nothing more. Deep down, he knew David was right. Although part of him wanted to forgive, the void Mary had left was too deep. Jane, who had stayed in the background, finally stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Matthew's shoulder. "I think you've heard their answer, Mary," Jane said softly but firmly. "It's best if you leave." Defeated, Mary took a step back, her eyes never leaving her children. David remained still and Matthew, visibly shaken, sought refuge next to Jane. The children she had abandoned were no longer hers. And as she slowly walked away, Mary realized that forgiveness wasn't something you could always earn, no matter how much you wanted it. David and Matthew watched her leave in silence. The echoes of the well still resonated in their hearts, but this time, with the certainty that their true family was here, with Jane, in the home she had given them. The day after Mary's return unfolded in tense silence in Jane's house. David got up early, as usual, and headed to the workshop without saying a word. Matthew, on the other hand, stayed in his room longer than usual, deep in thought. Jane, who knew her son's rhythms and emotions well, immediately noticed the change. She understood that, after what had happened the night before, the reopened wounds would need time to heal, if they ever did. As Matthew lay in bed, the image of his biological mother wouldn't leave his mind. Mary's desperate expression, the pleading tone in her voice, and, most of all, the look of anguish when David had so coldly rejected her. Matthew knew his brother was right not to accept her back, that what Mary had done was unforgivable. But something inside him gnawed at him deeply. Was it right never to forgive? Finally, unable to stay in bed any longer, Matthew got up. He found Jane in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as always. Despite the heavy atmosphere, she maintained a serene expression, aware that the boys needed stability. "Good morning, sweetheart," Jane said softly, as she poured coffee into a cup. "Good morning," Matthew replied, his voice revealing his emotional exhaustion. Jane gestured for him to sit down, and in silence, she served breakfast for them both. For several minutes, neither said a word. Matthew stirred his cup thoughtfully, while Jane watched him with tenderness, waiting for him to speak when he was ready. Finally, Matthew sighed and broke the silence. "I can't stop thinking about her. About Mary," he admitted, looking down. "David was harsh, but, I don't know, maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she really was lost, like she said." Jane approached the table and sat across from him. Her gaze was soft but firm, like someone who understood that life rarely offers simple answers. "Matthew, no one can tell you how you should feel," she began, gently taking his hand. "What Mary did was terrible, something no mother should ever do. But it's also true that sometimes people make wrong decisions for reasons we don't understand. That doesn't mean you have to accept her actions or forget them. But forgiveness is something only you can decide if you want to offer." Matthew looked into her eyes, his mind reflecting his inner conflict. It was clear that the young man was grappling with the contradiction between his need for understanding and the harsh reality of what he had experienced. "And you, Jane?" he asked suddenly. "Would you forgive her?" Jane sighed deeply before responding. She knew this was a difficult question and didn't want to influence Matthew's decision, but she also couldn't be dishonest. "I don't know if I could forgive her, Matthew. What she did caused enormous pain. And while I do feel compassion for her as a human being, I can't ignore the suffering she caused. I watched you both struggle, trying to understand why your mother left you. For me, my priority will always be you two. Mary made a mistake that changed your lives forever, and that doesn't go away easily." Matthew nodded slowly, absorbing Jane's words. He knew she was right, but still he felt a weight on his heart, a need not to carry resentment forever. "Maybe I don't have to forgive her right now," he finally said, his voice soft but determined. "But I also don't want to hate her. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget, but I don't want that anger to control me." Jane looked at him with admiration. Matthew had always been the more thoughtful one, willing to understand the emotions behind actions. Though both brothers had endured a difficult path, it was clear that each was navigating it in different ways. "What you decide is fine, Matthew. The important thing is that you do what brings you peace," Jane said, squeezing his hand gently. "And I'll always be here to support you, just as I always have." At that moment, David walked through the door, covered in dust and with dirty hands from working in the workshop. Seeing Matthew and Jane sitting at the table, he exchanged a glance with them, aware that something important had been discussed in his absence. "What were you talking about?" David asked, frowning. Matthew took a deep breath, knowing that his brother didn't share the same feelings of doubt. David was firm and decisive in his judgments, and he had made it clear the night before that there was no place for Mary in their lives. Yet Matthew felt the need to speak. "I was thinking about what happened yesterday, and about Mary," Matthew said, meeting David's gaze. "I know what she did, and I agree with you that we can't just take her back. But I also feel like I don't want to live with this hatred. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her, but I don't want that to control me." David looked at him for a few moments, his expression hard. For him, everything was clear. Mary had failed, abandoned them, and didn't deserve a second chance. However, though his instinct was to protect Matthew from more pain, he knew he couldn't decide for him. "Do what you think is best, Matthew," David finally said, in a tone softer than usual. "But don't let her fool you. No matter how many times she says she loved us, what she did, there's no going back from that." Jane watched the interaction between the two brothers, noticing the rigidity in David and the tenderness in Matthew. She knew that both had been affected in different ways by Mary's abandonment, and that each needed to find their own way of dealing with the trauma. "I just know one thing," Matthew said, with more confidence in his voice. "No matter what happens, the important thing is that we're together. Mary is part of our past, but you, Jane, you're our present and future." Matthew's words resonated in the small kitchen, filling the air with palpable emotion. David, though he didn't say it aloud, felt a weight lift from his chest upon hearing what his brother had said. Despite everything they had been through, they had found in Jane the home that Mary had never given them. "You're right, Matthew," David responded, nodding slightly. "We'll always be together, no matter what." Jane, deeply moved, couldn't stop her eyes from filling with tears. Though the shadow of Mary still hung over them, the strength of the bond they had built over the years was much more powerful. In that moment, they all understood that, regardless of what the past might bring, they had found their own way to move forward. Time, like the gentle breeze that wound through the hills of Willow Creek, began to heal the wounds reopened by Mary's return. Though her reappearance had unsettled David and Matthew, the strength of the home Jane had built endured. As the days passed, the discussions about Mary faded, and daily life resumed its course. David and Matthew continued to expand their business. As their reputation for quality work spread to neighboring towns, new opportunities began to emerge. The small workshop had grown into a family business that employed several members of the community. David remained reserved and serious, but the success of the enterprise gave him a sense of purpose, a way to channel the anger and pain he had carried for so long. Matthew, on the other hand, found the inner peace he had been seeking. The decision not to let hatred toward Mary consume him allowed him to focus on the present, and his bond with Jane grew even stronger. Though memories of his biological mother still visited him during moments of reflection, they no longer tormented him. He accepted that life did not always offer easy answers, and that some scars simply had to coexist with the happiness he had built. On a sunny day at the end of summer, Jane decided it was time to have an important conversation with her sons. There was something she had been holding in her heart, something she felt she finally needed to share. Sitting on the porch of the house, enjoying the fresh afternoon air, David, as usual, was absorbed in his thoughts, while Matthew delicately carved a piece of wood. Jane watched them with a mixture of pride and melancholy, knowing that now was the right moment. "Boys, I need to talk to you about something important," she began, her usual calm demeanor carrying a tone of seriousness that caught their attention. David looked up, and Matthew set the piece of wood aside. Both of them focused on what Jane had to say. "It's been many years since you came into my life, and there isn't a single day that I don't thank fate for finding you that night," Jane said with a nostalgic smile. "You are my sons. Of that I have no doubt. But I know that as time passes, questions may arise, or even the desire to reconnect with the past. And I want you to know that, as much as it may hurt me, I will always support any decision you make." David frowned, immediately understanding what Jane was referring to: Mary. Despite his firm conviction that their biological mother no longer had a place in their lives, Jane's words opened a small crack in his thoughts. He knew she spoke from a place of love, and the idea that she might feel insecure or replaced made him deeply uncomfortable. "I don't need to reconnect with Mary," David responded firmly. "You are our mother. You always have been. That's not going to change." Jane looked at him with tenderness, but also with the wisdom of someone who understood that life was more complicated than a young man's certainties. "I know, son, but I also know that sometimes the wounds of the past make us search for answers, even when we think we don't need them. If you ever feel that need, I want you to know it's okay. You won't lose me by trying to understand who Mary was." Matthew, who had been silent until that moment, spoke softly. "I've thought about Mary," he confessed, looking at Jane. "Not because I want her to be part of our lives again, but because I need to close that chapter once and for all. But what I feel more than the need to see her again is gratitude for you, Jane. You gave us what she couldn't. You gave us a life, you gave us a family." Matthew's words hung in the air. David glanced at his younger brother, surprised by the maturity and calm with which he spoke. Although David's own heart was still hardened toward Mary, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief hearing Matthew express what he himself had never been able to put into words. "Matthew's right," David said, his tone softer now. "There's nothing we need to find in the past. Everything we need is here, with you, Jane." Jane felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she listened to her sons. She had always feared that Mary's return might shake the foundation of what she had built. But now she saw that her love and dedication had been enough to help heal David and Matthew's wounds. "You don't know how much your words mean to me," Jane said, her eyes filling with tears. "I've watched you both grow, watched you become strong and good men, and I know you'll keep moving forward, with or without the shadows of the past." The sun was setting, casting golden rays across the landscape, creating a moment of peace and reflection on the porch of the house. David, Matthew, and Jane sat in silence for a while, enjoying each other's company, feeling as though they had finally found a place of acceptance and tranquility. That night, as everyone slept, Matthew quietly slipped out of bed and went to the porch. The cool night air wrapped around him, and for a few minutes he just stood there, gazing at the stars. But in his mind, there was one last thing he needed to do. Taking a piece of paper and a pencil, Matthew sat at the table and began to write a letter. It wasn't long or complicated, but it contained the words he felt were necessary for his own closure. As the ink filled the page, a sense of relief began to settle in his chest. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope addressed to Mary Collins. He didn't know if she would receive it or if she would care. For Matthew, writing those words wasn't about reconciliation with her. but with himself. It was his way of saying goodbye to the weight he had carried for so many years. The next morning, he left the letter on the kitchen table without a word. David saw it but asked no questions. He understood that this was the closure Matthew needed, and though he himself didn't feel the same, he respected his brother's decision. Jane later picked up the letter and, without asking questions, took it to the post office. She knew that for Matthew, sending that letter represented something profound. A farewell, a necessary goodbye to allow him to move forward without the burden of the past. In time, the letter was lost in the folds of fate, and life in Willow Creek continued. Days passed quietly, with David and Matthew dedicating themselves to their business and the community they had helped to flourish. The bond between the two brothers grew even stronger, built not only on the hardships of the past but also on the acceptance that, despite the scars, they had found a home and a family in Jane, and in each other.